first of all, thank you everyone that's joined us today on this webinar. My name is Rebecca Siciliano and I'm the MD for Tiger Recruitment. Today we are talking about the very important topic of diversity and inclusion. This is something that's been brought to the forefront due to some really unfortunate world events, and that's really driven, I guess, a lot of awareness around the Black Lives Matter movement and made sure that it's something that everyone is talking about. I think we've got, as businesses, there are a lot of organisations that have already got very robust diversity and inclusion policies in place. But I think this has really made everyone realise we need to do a lot more. There's a lot more that can be done on this topic. And that's where we wanted to bring this awareness to everyone today as well. Diversity on a whole is such a broad topic. There are so many areas that are really important to discuss. Today, what we're going to really focus on are some practical steps that employers can take around diversity and inclusion in the workplace. As I mentioned, a lot of companies will already have policies in place, but it's just about looking at what we can be doing better as well. We've got 3 incredible experts joining us today to offer their insights as well. We're going to have opportunities for everyone to ask some questions as well at the end using the Q&A function on Zoom. If there are any questions that do go unanswered, you can email us at tiger@recruitment.co.uk and we'll respond to those questions as well. So I'm going to start, first of all, by thanking our experts for joining us today and introducing them. First up, we have Simon Fanshawe, who is OBE and partner at Diversity by Design. Simon is co-founder of Stonewall, who are an LGBTQ foundation, and he's a leading voice on diversity and in the public and private spheres. We've also got Holiday Phillips joining us today. Thanks for joining us, Holiday. Holiday is a founder and chief wisdom officer at KULA. KULA is a consulting, coaching and training company that helps organisations scale with soul. She offers conscious leadership and diverse, equitable and inclusive cultures. As well as all of that, she is a writer, speaker, coach and sociologist and about to have a baby. We also have Sarah Ramsden joining us today.
Hi.
Sarah is a management consultant at the Clear Company. She delivers inclusive hiring training and has 20 years plus experience in the HR industry. She's worked with boards and senior executives throughout her career as well. So thank you all for joining us today, and let's get started. So first of all, I guess we want to look at the state of play in 2020. So Holiday, I'm going to start off sort of directing this question at you. So I think, this year that D&I conversation has really ramped up significantly. Have you noticed a shift in perspective this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the area that I primarily focus on is racial equity, anti-racism. And obviously this year has been a huge explosion, or the last 3 months. I think one of the most interesting things for me, both culturally, but also within organizations, is there's been a real shift of focus kind of down the chain of levels of racism, from kind of systemic institutional racism to really focusing on the interpersonal and intrapersonal level. So we're talking about white privilege, white fragility, allyship, and the focus is really on what you as an individual can and must do, which I think is both good and also incredibly risky, which I can potentially speak to later. I'd be really interested from the other 2 speakers about how that shift is reflected across other diversity characteristics, but I certainly think one of the biggest shifts in perspective this year in terms of race is that people are, in my lifetime, so the last 3.5 decades, really positioning themselves in the conversation rather than looking at racist systems out there, racist people out there. People are looking at what's my role and what's my responsibility in this system, which, as I said, I think is both good and risky.
Yeah. Simon and Sarah, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think Holly's made a really interesting observation there, which is this difference between the personal and the organisational. there is absolute value in so if we're talking about race, or we're talking about sexual orientation, or we're talking about men and women, the sexes, there is an absolute value in men thinking about our relationships to women. Very, very simple thing. Do men simply think carefully when you're walking along the street about what your relationship is to women, particularly at night? Very simple things like that. So those are valuable things to do. There is no doubt about it for me that being married to somebody who is Nigerian, he has a very different concept of race and racism because he comes from an African country. So coming to the UK, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I have learned from being in day-to-day contact with him. So the interpersonal is really important, and it tells you an awful lot of things. But if the answer to structural racism, the fact that housing is segregated, the fact that black people are potentially poorer than white people, if the answer to that is for the entire country to go, and particularly the white middle class, to go into a massive downward swoop of guilt-induced self-improving therapy, then we are really going on a hide into nothing. This is a real danger, as Holly was pointing out. I mean, the answer is not individual. The answer is that you will remember from the famous Macpherson report, the institutional racism is the issue, the institutional sexism. That's what companies have to hoist in. So yes, there's individual work to be done. But actually, if you look at the George Floyd video as a last point, look at the expression on that man's face as he is killing that person. He is looking at the other cops. And what he's saying, in my understanding of that face, is this is how we treat them. And if you look at the other cops, they're not all white. Now, that tells me that actually you reform the police not just by focusing on race, but you focus on culture and the environment in which those sexisms, racisms, homophobia, and so on and forth is reinforced. So we've got to get the balance right between the personal guilt. I mean, I won't be a fragile white person. I'm sorry. I will not accept that therapy is the answer to racism.
Yeah. Sarah, is there anything you've got to add on that as well?
Yeah, I think I just totally agree. It's about culture change and what is now an ongoing conversation, an opportunity to really turn the dial in this space. You know, leaders prepared to have those uncomfortable conversations, and I think we've got a great opportunity to make sure that that change does happen.
Yeah. And Sarah, further to that, what are some of the key trends that you're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we've certainly seen an increase, not only in the dialogue around diversity and inclusion, but most importantly, we're seeing organisations taking practical actions, being really wanting to be seen, to be taking action and making measurable changes, which is such an exciting opportunity ahead. So, for example, with COVID, the lockdown has brought a sharp focus on the need for inclusive leadership, you know, leading remote teams and how to lead with empathy and understanding and recognising that people have been impacted differently, and also the opportunity that's created for flexible working, you know, breaking down those barriers that have been in place for many years. It's been a real positive enabler for many people, not having that commute, flexibility around their working hours and self-management to a degree as well. And also, as you recognise, this has been truly challenging for other groups, for our LGBT plus colleagues who may be out at work and not at home, who rely on that work environment for that emotional support. You know, we have stories of trans people getting changed in secret for teen calls as their family don't know or understand. So the impact there, and for disabled people, well, more than ever, you know, our colleagues can work in a flexible way. So feeling really empowered that this is an opportunity for them to thrive. Visually impaired and blind colleagues finding a move from presenteeism is far more inclusive for them, and colleagues who are deaf or hearing impaired equally. are advocates of Teams and the technology with the captions and the opportunities that creates for them. And for us, we see that our clients and partners are acutely aware of the inclusion challenges that have been facing them, and looking at new communication channels and forums to put in place, and investing significantly in education and resources.
Yeah, I think it is interesting in itself, isn't it? Like the last few months where we've had all of the COVID things that have been happening, in addition to all of the Black Lives Matter movement. Like, there's a lot of, I've never even thought about the fact that some of the flexibility from working from home through COVID has the effect that it's had on diversity in the workplace as well. So really interesting. Simon, one of the other things I've noticed, like the language and vocabulary of D&I has evolved, and it's something that is constantly evolving as well. What advice do you have for businesses that are worried about saying the wrong thing?
First bit of advice I have to anybody involved in questions of diversity and questions of inclusion, I don't mean this as a criticism. Could everybody stop using abbreviations? Could we stop calling it D&I? Could we stop talking about BAME? Is it really the case that all black people and Asian people are the same? Are you all a minority? My friend Kwame, who runs the Young Vic, says I'm a global majority. I rather like that view. I am not LGBT. Somebody said to me the other day, are you LGBT? I said, well, you can't be all of them. These anachronisms. There's a Freudian slip. What is happening around diversity and inclusion is that it is becoming professionalized to its own disadvantage. It is becoming transactional. It's becoming automatic. What do I do? Oh, okay, so I'm going to make my company diversity and inclusion positive. So the first thing I'm going to do is staff networks. Then I'm going to get reverse mentoring. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a role model. That'd be good. We'll have a role model. And people run through this set of automatic actions. Now, look, I'm not saying there isn't a value to staff networks. I am saying if you want staff networks to work, there are a number of things, for instance. So you talk about language. Language evolves. We all use language differently. People talk about making mistakes. People don't make mistakes with language. They just use language in a particular way. So let me give you an example. The BBC's just been told off for including the N-word as a bit of verbatim reporting in a news report. Now, there's a debate to be had about that. The family said they wanted it because they wanted to indicate the strength of feeling, the vileness, the repulsiveness of the racist insults they put up with. Many black people said, we don't want that to be heard on screens, particularly said by a white person. That's a proper discussion. No one's making a mistake there. That's a really proper discussion about how we use those things. People use this acronym LGBTQ. I find the word queer fundamentally insulting. I grew up with it being shouted at me, and no amount of people with pink hair telling me they're reclaiming is going to make it feel nice to hear for me. Would you all please stop using this acronym LGBTQ+? It's meaningless. Now, that's my view. There is a view. So what am I saying? Right. The language is, there's intent. There's nasty intent. Nasty intent is something we can say, actually, would you not do that, please? But the way in which people talk to each other is a matter of negotiation. And if you find something uncomfortable, companies need to find ways of giving people the framework. Very simple example, if you're in a no phone carriage, quiet carriage on a train, it's much easier to say to somebody who's using their phone, would you mind not using your phone? So what companies have to do is provide a framework for the discussion. Don't start banning words. Encourage and be brave enough to have the discussion. I'll give you a very good example and then I will be quiet. There's a wonderful trans activist that I know called Jackie Gavin, who I've known for a million years. And Jackie was involved in the Gender Recognition Act and all those kind of things. She's a civil servant now. She works for a fire service. Jackie and I did an event last year for about 50 people at one of the big four consultancies, and we were talking about, it was coming out day. I mean, everything's got a day, isn't it now? You can't wait for National Gallbladder Week, can you? But anyway, we're doing a coming out day thing, and I did my contribution, Jackie does hers. And in her contribution, she talked about how she had been Scott before she was Jackie. And somebody asked a question. So we talked to each other, and then somebody asked a question in the audience. They said, I don't understand this just dead naming, misgendering stuff. I don't understand this. This is confusing me. This is a woman who worked in HR, and she was having real difficulties with it. Jackie said something so fantastic. She said to this woman, be calm about it. Just be calm and ask. You know, just ask people what the issue is and how they want to be. And then she said something which will stay with me forever. She said, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Scott's bravery. I carry him everywhere I go. And you could feel in the audience a kind of sense of relief and admiration for Jackie, but relief that actually what she'd done is said to everybody, look, calm down about this. Let's find our way through it. So that's what I would say to people. That's the brave and difficult thing. It's not appointing gatekeepers of language and then in a kind of top-down way policing people's thinking. That's not the way we're going to solve this.
Yeah. Holiday, do you have anything to add to that as well?
I mean, I'm in complete agreement, and I personally have felt deeply uncomfortable by the shutting down of the conversation that's ensued in this BBC incident, because my personal instinctive reaction as a Black person was, I'm so glad that word was said. And I think that one of the worrying things that happens both culturally and then also organisationally is that we assume that every Black person or every person across the LGBTQ+ spectrum feels exactly the same way, has exactly the same opinions on things, and that's just fundamentally not true and actually deeply offensive. So yeah, I really agree with that point.
Yeah. And back to you, Simon, like if we are inadvertently causing offence to someone, like what should we do? Is it just about sort of being open and addressing it?
Well, I think there are two or three things. I think that, as Holly says, the starting point has got to be for companies to say, if we're serious about diversity and if we're serious about inclusion, what does that mean? Diversity is about recognising the value of difference. So I'm just writing a book, little plug. It's called The Power of Difference. Okay, it's about the fact that where companies really get value out of their staff and the staff get value out of the company is when you see difference, when you value it, and when you learn how to combine it. That's at an organisational level, individual level. Inclusion means really understanding that there are a vast range of voices. So what people have to do is think of that in terms of how do we talk about our discussions about the company? How do we engage people, not in terms of these big groups, but only in terms of the groups when the group has salience and then individual voices. So let's make sure that we distinguish between the group voice. Have we got an issue within the company about race? That's a group voice. Every Black, Asian and mixed race person knows what the fist in the face means. That's when the group has salience. But then not make the mistake of quietening other individual voices. So your framework for discussion, whether it's about issues about the company or whether it's issues around diversity, has got to find a way of encouraging the debate in that sort of way. Then there's questions of individual language. We use a technique, there are lots of variations of this, but we gather staff's verbatim responses to open questions about how they feel about being in an organisation. So we might ask them about being a woman in an organisation, or we might just ask them generally and then we'll monitor the results. So what we do is we collect a load of verbatim stuff and we feed it back to the leadership and we say to them, not what do you think, not what you're going to do, what do you feel about this?
Yeah.
So in other words, get an emotional traction. And what we found with this is that if you start, the issue of language then comes up constantly. And for instance, to take an example, can't I compliment a woman any longer on what she's wearing, says the man? Well, if you look at most of the stuff that we get back from women, and you three can tell me whether I'm right or wrong about this, but most of the stuff that I've ever read from women say that what they want to be complimented on is their work, not their clothes. That compliments, by their definition, are about how they're received, not how they're intended. That discussion is the most important discussion that underlies the use of language. It's not your intention, oh, I was just joking, it was just a bit of banter, I didn't realise it, but I was saying. intention's not the point, it's how it's received. So what you have to do in that situation is to provide people with a way of saying, actually, I feel a bit uncomfortable about that. So the important thing is not the rules, the important thing is the discussion. And the old Vic did some fantastic work on this after the Kevin Spacey allegations of sexual harassment. And they have a phrase which they worked through all the staff with, and it was their decision, okay, not okay. So that's just a formulaic way of doing it. But I suppose underlying this is this idea that you have to think about the effect of what you say, but the dialogue in working through that can't be punitive. It doesn't help it if it's punitive. And I'm not talking about calling somebody the N-word. That is clearly something you can say, we won't have that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Holiday, I mean, a lot of people are talking at the moment about, self-education being the first step towards inclusivity as well. How important do you think that is, and how is it something that businesses can incorporate as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think about this a lot. I think that there's a way in which self-education is extremely important. And then there are also two kind of risks, I think, that I was alluding to earlier that we really have to be super aware of. It's important to what Simon was saying. We talk a lot about intention and impact, and intention being the quality behind what we're saying, what we actually mean to do, and then impact how the person, as Simon said, receives it. So it's like take microaggressions. I worked in technology for 13 years, was almost always the only Black person in the room. And I couldn't count on like everyone here's hands and fingers the amount of time people commented on my hair. So when my hair was out in an afro, oh, your hair looks so funky, it's so wild and cool. If I wore my hair straight, oh, you're looking so smart today. Now, people were trying to compliment me. The intention was good. And I get that. I'm okay with that. But the point being that if that person has no education about the politics of Black hair, about the fact that the coarseness of hair was used as a way of dividing slaves, then that's just a compliment. But to me, it is a microaggression or an aggression. So it really comes down to, without self-education, you're ignorant, and then you have an impact which is hurtful, even though the intention is good. So I think self-education is really important to that extent. But the parts of it that I'm that organizations and leaders in particular have to be very aware of is that if self-education becomes the primary manifestation of allyship or diversity and inclusion work, it's really easy to get stuck there because it's super easy. Anyone can just sit around and keep reading books about racism and all of this without taking action. It's easy and it's comfortable. So exactly as Simon said, like if our anti-racism work or other allyship work becomes about self-development, we're really in the wrong place. And I also think that, again, I can only speak for myself, but not being in a family, in a community of Black people, for most of us, it is pretty low down on our agenda whether people are commenting on our hair. It annoys me, it pisses me off sometimes, but ultimately I don't really care about that much as I care about not seeing anyone who looks like me in a boardroom, or the fact that my cousins and my brothers are 3 times more likely to get excluded from school or be in prison. Like, that's what I care about. Mm-hmm. So for me, self-education is good, but it's really one relatively minor part of a bigger picture. And I do worry that we're getting stuck there because it's easy, comfortable, and makes us feel good.
Yeah. So a lot of it does come back to more that systematic racism and addressing that, and that's more important than the self-education piece in some respect as well. Mm. The other thing I sort of want to talk about, so obviously I know there are some businesses that have already got their D&I policies in place, but I'm also aware that for some smaller businesses, like this is a new area and something that they are starting to sort of realise the importance of. Sarah, I'm going to start with you, and this is sort of looking at the businesses that have already got policies in place. How can businesses sort of check and make sure that the policies they've got in place are aligned with best practice?
Yeah, great question. I think just starting to go back to Simon's point about that inclusive language, it's so important that the language is right in those policies and procedures. So, for example, the use of the word minority once, puts you straight into a negative state of mind and not, looking forward to the changes that you need to make. Whereas just the use of underrepresentation instead of minority, it's so much more powerful and an aspiration then and a need to change, I think, comes across. I think the first thing is to stop assuming or guessing, and with authenticity, really dig deep and find out what is actually happening in your organisation. Simon mentioned about, audits, asking people, getting those really, really insightful quotes about what life is like now, and asking yourself, how well do you know your people? How diverse is your workforce? And do you truly consider diversity and inclusion as part of your business as usual? So step one is to find that out. Now, we clearly have our own inclusion standards adopted industry-wide, bit of a plug there, and we help organisations set those standards and give them toolkits and guidance around best practice for policies. And I think what's important is that there's a number of organisations out there. Obviously, Simon, from a Stonewall perspective, Disability Confidence Scheme are all great places to go and have a look and help you with those best practice standards and helping you on that journey.
Excellent. And Simon, for those businesses that are taking the first steps, what do you think is important for them?
It's just important on a note there. What Sarah said is that, I was involved in starting Stonewall, but if anybody's happens to have followed me, they will know that I'm now very, very critical of Stonewall's public positions, because I think it's not doing any of the things that we're suggesting. It's not hearing all voices. It talks about trans rights as if there is a singular group of people, and actually clearly there is a huge range of difference. There's a huge range of difference between lesbians around issues of sex-based women's rights and so on and so forth. And I think part of the problem is that Stonewall has set itself up as an authority in the form of a gatekeeper. So one thing I would say is that it's very important that we don't just companies don't just buy into, and Holly was sort of saying this, that buy into the current trend on whatever it is, right? What's happening is that you'll find that there's a line being driven by Black Lives Matters or by a Stonewall or whatever, and if you take Black Lives Matters as an example, Black Lives Matters is the child really of Extinction Rebellion. It's not the child of the civil rights movement. Clearly there's cross-fertilization there. But actually, if you look at the way it behaves, its tactics and so on and so forth, it has a very particular view, it seems to me, of race. Stonewall has a very particular view now of gender ideology. These are only single views. They're not the view of everybody in those groups and communities. In other words, we should start to argue properly and exchange views about values and politics, not about identities. Identity is now becoming a buzzword, but actually people who share an identity only share that in certain respects. It matters at certain points to all of us that are, I'm not gay all day. It only matters at certain points in my life. So what should companies do? Back again to this point of understanding real diversity of voices and really trying to find ways of including them. Companies who are starting out have got a fantastic opportunity. And it's a real classic. I've worked with many startups over the years, and there's that amazing moment when companies are going from sort of 3 to 5 to 10 to 40. That's the moment when you can sow through recruitment. You can sow the idea of difference and diversity into the very way the company works. So if you see diversity as an approach to talent, and the thing to do is to ask yourself this question. We are startup A, and we are about to go to 30, 40 employees. What are we trying to do? What kind of diversity? And in what way will diversity help us to do that? Because it's not, the thing about diversity, it's not just, oh, let's get women, let's get black people. It's not like, pop down to the women's shop and get 6 assorted. you want women to bring something particular in combination with men. You want cross-cultural. So I'll give you an example. A history department we once worked with said, we want to diversify the staff. And I said, why? You're doing brilliantly, great research, great staff, great pupils, great attainment, it's all going fantastically, what's your thing? And the person around the department said, it's simply stated but difficult to achieve. There is great literature being written in English by people who are not English. I want to represent that in the department that I run. What this person wanted was Chimamanda Adichie. Now, you know, so what that department would look like, it would appear that that's ethnic diversity. That wasn't ethnic diversity that that department was looking for. It was cultural, geographic diversity that they were looking for. So what I would say to those companies is build your diversity around what you do as a talent strategy to equip you in whatever markets you're in, with whatever products you're in, whatever level of innovation you need, and so on and so forth. Diversity is not an abstract. People aren't diverse. They bring difference between each other. So build it in that sort of way. Ask that question, what is diversity for in our company?
Yeah, absolutely. And Holiday, what do you think are the major challenges that companies experience as they try to achieve diversity within the business?
Well, I think that actually to follow on from that point, one of the biggest challenges is companies not knowing why they're doing what they're doing and really rushing to action without thoughtfulness. I was doing some consulting work with a company, and they said to me, we want 30% BAME people. And I said, why? Why 30%? And no one could answer. I was in a group of kind of 10 leaders. And it was like, okay, so why? Oh, because it feels like a good number. And I was saying, a good number for what? Well, is that based in the UK? Because that's unreasonably high in the UK, given that the UK is like 87% or something white. Or is it for London, in which case it's unreasonably low, because then that should be around 50%. And really no one could answer that question. And I had a similar experience when I was doing some consulting work with a company in Canada, and they said, well, we want to represent all different cultures, so we're going to have a kosher section in our fridge, and we're going to celebrate Kwanzaa. But do you have any Jewish staff? No. Do any of the Black Jews in your team celebrate Kwanzaa? Don't know. So really starting, and I think it's a laziness, but it is rooted in good intention. It's like, we want to do something good, and I honour that, but the laziness of thought is bad. So I think, yeah.
No, I was just going to add something, which is, sorry to cut across, but it's just this idea, which is, people say, we want to be representative of the borough we're the council for, the customers we serve, the staff we've got, whatever. And actually, well, if you take a council and London, there are 54 languages spoken in London according to the 2011 census, and 53 minor languages. So trying to be representative, as an example, in a London borough with your, so good luck with that. What organisations, it seems to me, need to do is they need to, as you say, they need to really understand the value and the purpose of difference in their organisation, and that it exists. And they need to be agile enough to adapt services, to offer services, to recognise how people differ in their approach to their customers. So if you look at makeup companies, that's a classic, where it really matters when you're trying to sell makeup, the different ways in which people use it. Medicine's another one. And we're doing some, talking to some gynecologists recently and obstetricians. Not my special subject. Fascinating, because of course women approach pregnancy and fertility and all those issues very differently in different cultural ways. Sorry, Holly, I was cutting across, but I get quite excited about this idea of representative. It's unfortunately, it feels a good thing to say, but actually, it doesn't really work, as you say. It doesn't really work. You have to think more deeply about what you're really trying to do with a company. Sorry, go on. I'll shut up now.
No, well, all of that, yeah, completely. That's great. And actually, so that point, to be really aware of that. And I think the other point, this is something again I've seen in my actual work, is in trying to build a culture of inclusion, actually building a culture that supports and encourages shaming of those who don't use the right words, do the right actions. I've seen this a lot with language. We don't use this word here, and if you do use this word here, you're racist, transphobic, etc. And with my sociologist hat in there, I really dug for this. There is not a single piece of social research that shows that shaming is an effective long-term motivator for action. It shows the complete opposite.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the things that companies really need to be careful of is that don't try and build a culture of inclusion at the cost of grace and compassion and actually patience. And always assuming negative intent, and this is something I've seen, creates a class of people who are bitter and resentful, and kind of fairly so, because they're being told they're a racist every day. And they don't think that they are. Pretty much nobody thinks that they're a racist. Like, the type of people who wear their racism on their sleeve are really few and far between, and they would enjoy being called a racist. So I think we have to be very, very careful about not creating cultural inclusion that says that anybody who doesn't do this, this and that to make people feel included is now excluded. So things like, me personally, I'm not for banning certain words or even prescribing certain words, or for assuming negative intent around microaggressions. So, and that's again my personal perspective, but I think companies need to get very, very clear around what the knock-on impact that what they're doing could have on the majority group, or even the minority groups, in trying to put in place kind of very strict policies. In kind of quest of making every single person feel safe all the time, because that is impossible.
Yeah, excellent. Sarah, I guess where you work with a lot of larger organisations as well, I'd be interested to hear your advice for companies that have got those established policies in place, but are now looking at, you know, what they need to do to take them to the next level.
Yeah, thanks. And just connecting back to that, you know, the importance of connecting to the personal why for the organisation. What we found is it's really important that leaders connect to their personal why as well, and share that and are really authentic with that to create that inclusive culture. And often they've thought about the organisational why, but not their personal why. So that's an interesting conversation. In terms of you know, you've got your measures in place, what next? Obviously it's really important to look at, you know, what are they telling you, what's missing, etc., and take that whole employee life cycle view practically and say, you know, is diversity inclusion woven in throughout? Have we got a behavioural framework to explain and provide that benchmark of what good looks like in our organisation, that, coming back to Simon's earlier point on the train, people can then have those uncomfortable conversations in a safer way to say, actually, that's not living our behaviours, you know, and holding people to account to that. I think there's a number of things as well, thinking about the future demands, the future strategy very much, and what are the priorities there. Obviously, with the COVID-19 impact, people wanting to work from home moving forward, we've put some really critical urgent steps in place, but what are they going to need to thrive moving forward? Are they going to be okay working at their dining room tables moving forward? And thinking about that employee voice moving forward as we go through a number of changes, and getting that information, that rich data, to help shape the inclusion agenda moving forward. Yeah,
excellent. Sarah, the other thing that I guess is very relevant for a lot of our clients is just around recruitment as well.
Yes.
So when it comes to the recruitment side of things, like what are some of the steps that are important when you're sort of planning that diversity and inclusion as part of your recruitment strategy?
Absolutely. I think, you know, always it's important to get the basics right. So we have lots of conversations around that job design, that job description stage, and very much making sure that there aren't any barriers in those job descriptions creating adverse impact. You know, we still see a lot of needs a degree. Okay, so why do they need a degree? What actual capabilities do you need for the role? What does success look like? And having those challenging conversations at the beginning, getting diverse views around, really sets the recruitment recruitment process up for success at the beginning. And then we've got more and more hiring managers asking for advice on how do I extend my talent pool? How do I reach those underrepresented groups, which is great to see progress. Often they weren't looking to get into that space, so helping them with some ideas and some thoughts around that. Obviously, with neurodiversity, job design opens new fields, thinking about job carving, job designing differently to allow people to thrive and open up a lot more opportunities. Couple of thoughts there.
Excellent. Is there anything else, I guess, from Simon or Holiday, anything else that you think is important in businesses' recruitment strategies?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sort of a bit of a plug, really. We based on there's some very interesting work. If anybody wants to read this fantastic book called What Works by somebody called Professor Iris Bohnet, B-O-H-N-E-T. And Iris is the academic dean at Harvard Kennedy Business School. And she has spent an awful lot of her life looking at the impact of bias and how it works, if you like. And by the way, one thing actually, stop wasting money on implicit bias training and all this. Bias is not implicit at all. We've all got them. And if you concentrate hard and work a bit on them, you can realise what they are and then you do something about them. So another thing is a bit of saved money. Instead of doing that, go through a process of redesigned recruitment. Iris has got some really interesting ideas from her research about the way in which we can help ourselves to make better decisions. And the way you do that is picking up on Sarah's point. The first thing I've turned it into what we call it the virtuous circle of selection. It's a bit like the question about diversity before. What's the team that you're recruiting into trying to do? So what kind of diversity would help it to do it better? So what's this role specifically about at this moment, at this time in this organisation? So who have you got? And that's both who they are and how they are at work. So their contribution to the team in terms of personality, but also what they bring through their identity and their history and their background. So how can we identify who we want to add so the team can do what they want to do better? So if you think of recruitment always as relative into teams, and you structure recruitment that way, we then combine it with what Iris discovered, which is that if you do something called joint selection, it's really about identifying explicitly the criteria you're recruiting against, and specifically identifying the metrics for judgments against those criteria. So what you're trying to do all the time is design out the kind of, oh, I just think they'll get on better. Oh, I think they'll hit the ground running. Oh, I just like them better. The more explicit you make these criteria and the assessment for it, and by the way, that's all that people who are making the selection should ever see. They shouldn't see CVs. They should see information. Don't blind CVs, because we all know how to read them even without names on them. It's dead easy to work out how old somebody is, even if there's no question that says how old they are. You work out when they went to school. It's not hard. Stop us falling into those traps and design it in such a way that we really can see the evidence against the criteria we've decided. And I did rather cheekily say to you at the beginning, when we were setting all this up, that if people do want to know more, send us your emails and we'll get in touch, because it's a relatively simple process to follow. And back to what I was saying before about companies that are starting up, if you do this right at the beginning, it puts into practice the sorts of things we've been talking about. It precisely values difference in recruitment rather than similarity, just in the way that you structure it. And just to give you an example, we've just done, last year we did some engineering professors, a notoriously male, biased sort of in terms of numbers, notoriously full of men. And jolly clever they are too. That's not the point. There are very few opportunities for women there, and they drop off as they go through. 2 professors, applicants 15%. Using this process, the shortlist was 35%, and we appointed 2 women. Not because they were women, but because they fulfilled the criteria that we'd set up at the beginning. And one of the unsuccessful applicants, we all just do feedback on these things, said a brilliant thing to us. She said, I felt like I'd been invited as a woman and assessed as a scientist. And that's the balance you're looking for there.
Yeah. There's one more question I want to sort of cover off on recruitment, which I think we're hearing about a lot. I'm interested to hear your views on shortlist quotas and blind CVs and that sort of practice used within coming into play within recruitment now.
Well, as I say, I think that CVs are The only value in a CV is there should be one person in the process, probably the HR person. I'll give you an example. We did one piece of senior recruitment in an NHS trust, and there were 2 sets of interviews, and there were 2 final candidates. And after the first set of interviews, the HR director went back to the CVs, which the panel hadn't seen. And she looked at the CVs and she saw that one of the candidates who was performed very well, but she kind of had a niggle about them. And sure enough, they'd been seconded out of their team 3 times in the last 18 months. Now, an experienced HR director will know they're either a genius or they're a nightmare, right? They're either people trying to get rid of them or they're so good they're being shared. It turned out that with a bit of investigation, actually, that weren't so good. So the HR director was able to go back and say to the selection team, I think with both of the candidates, you could explore secondments.
Yeah.
But in other words, don't use CVs. CVs, we've got to start taking them away, because all that we do is we read them in a particular way. So the key thing to get from long list to short list is to make sure you've got clear criteria, clear metrics for assessment of those, and that's all the evidence you see until you meet the person, because by then you've got an evidence base. So you haven't got favourites. You haven't got a favoured candidate. You don't, and we don't tell people the scores either. So they're meeting each candidate and judging them on the evidence they present against the criteria you set. And that helps us to get, I mean, obviously there's a whole set of questions about how you broaden the pipeline in the first place. And Sarah, you mentioned that, I think, right at the beginning, was actually you've really got to work hard to go and look in places you wouldn't. But your job design helps you, as you said, helps you to do that, because if you take energy, think of the brochures that all the oil companies and energy companies used to produce 10 years ago. It was white blokes with hard hats on oil rigs. And then they thought, oh God, oh blimey, it's all white blokes, better get white. So then they put white women next to white blokes in hard hats on oil rigs. Well, if you go and talk to people in energy now, it's not about being on oil rigs as much as it is these days, a whole revolution in the energy and extraction industries. So the skills you need now are wholly different from what they were 10, 15 years ago. So the opportunities for women, for instance, who typically don't find those good places to work, are enormously expanded. So it's something like that.
Excellent. Sarah, have you got anything to add in your thoughts?
Yeah, just some thoughts. Really, really interesting to hear that. I think for us, it's about, the targeting of the senior hires done in isolation can drive so many bad behaviours and actually put the organisation back, because it can reinforce that tokenism, those stereotypes, and therefore it needs to be part of a bigger programme. And successful organisations that we've seen make a step change in this space have invested in their hiring manager capability, and as Simon said, created those safe spaces for hiring managers to come together and practice how to do an interview using evidence, and then once they step out of that interview, allowing that time for them to classify and evaluate that evidence to make great hiring decisions, and having some great evidence to give feedback to develop their internal talent pipeline and for their employer brand externally. So it's not to be done in isolation. And I think those the CVs, the blind CVs, we're seeing more and more emerging talent programs not asking for CVs. We know the impact in terms of social mobility and not using them at all, and using online testing and having some really positive impact in terms of that diversity pipeline coming through as a result.
Excellent. So more sort of looking at the testing and those sorts of processes that we can use over just looking at a CV to see what's done. I just had a quick look at the questions there. Sorry to Holly, you were next, but just to pick up on one of the questions, which I think is relevant to that, is getting more representation, a greater combination of difference at those senior jobs is fundamental to change in the organisation. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. There's a confusion, I think, in some people's mind that does that mean some sort of positive discrimination? In other words, that there's some kind of trade-off between diversity and excellence. And I think it's important to say a couple of things. Firstly, looking for people who are talented, who are different from the people you've already got, and asking them to apply is not only lawful and legal, it's thoroughly encouraged.
both by the law and by good practice. So tapping people on the shoulder to apply is a dead good thing. So don't ever worry about doing that, because what you're doing is you're rebalancing your applications. So that's a good thing. The second thing is, back to the point about it's not just women or black people. So when we talk about, or gay people or whatever, when we talk about the representation at senior level, you've got to go back to that question of why. Why? What happens when you combine men and women in a board? What happens to the discussion of risk and strategy and blah, blah, blah? Well, what you're looking for then is not more women who are the same as men, because very often you find that people who get to the top of industries, actually they've all come up through a very similar route. They're actually more of the same is what you're doing when you recruit the best. So what you're looking for is people who can bring the difference that you've identified. So it's always remembering, you're not just saying, get me black people, get me women. You're saying, what we want is to understand what people can bring through their life experience. Yeah. One little example, if you're in an organization, the Financial Conduct Authority has a consumer protection, it's its first main objective given to it by Parliament. We did some work there once and they've done a report on complaints. It wasn't what we were doing, they just mentioned it. And they said, we've talked to everybody who complained. And we said, did you talk to people who didn't complain? Now, the reason we said that was that we looked at the objectives. The people who don't complain are the most excluded and unprotected as consumers. Yeah. The people who complain are people like you and probably all of us who ring up, EE the whole time and they go, hello, Simon. So the question is, why had they not thought of that? And what was really interesting, they were so interesting about this. Their conclusion was they didn't have people in the organisation, or if they did, they didn't tell them they valued it who'd grown up poor. In other words, it's not enough for organisations to be clever. Organisations also need that lived experience inside, which informs what they do, because that's how you create, in that case, great consumer protection. Right. So it's always making that link. So that's not positive discrimination anyway. It's actually positively putting together the right combination, which is different.
Yeah, excellent. Holiday, I'm just going to go to you because I felt like I saw a slight reaction from you when I asked that question as well. Like, did you have any sort of further thoughts around sort of the blind CV process and things like that?
I don't have clearly established thoughts on that. I think about it a lot. I think philosophically, I definitely orient from the place of most of us who are considered in the minority do not want special treatment. We just don't want to be treated worse. So I think that's where I orient from philosophically, and I think a lot about internal recruitment, because that's been kind of the area that I've worked in, getting people into leadership roles, mentorship opportunities, etc. And a lot of the time I've heard we need more women in leadership roles, we need more black people in leadership roles, etc. And the thing that I have found is that companies often want to skip immediately to the kind of diversity play before they actually look at their leadership development offering for everyone. And in my 13 years working at really some of the companies that are considered the best cultural companies in the world, because tech's often considered like the gold standard for culture, I've worked at one company that I think had a robust leadership development offering. The rest of them were very, very poor in that area. So for me, it's like, before you jump to what are we doing wrong about diversity, I would look at what are we doing wrong, full stop, about developing talent in our organisation? What mentorship opportunities are we offering across the board? And once you are confident that you have a robust offering, then you can really isolate the problem. If you're still finding that you're not getting diversity in the people who are rising up to the top, then you can isolate the problem. But I think it's very misguided to try and fix a particular part of a holistically broken system.
Yeah.
So I think that, and I imagine that's the same for external recruitment. Like, is your system robust, full stop, before looking at pinpointing one part, which takes us back to the kind of fad phase, I just need to do something immediately. So yeah, that's my perspective. I'm not sure, to be honest, on my hard perspective on positive.
Yeah.
I have to think about that more.
Interesting. So we've got some time now to jump to the questions, and we have got quite a few, so I don't think unfortunately we'll be able to get through all of them. First question I'll start off with. So following Simon's response to staff networks, my firm has a DS&I, or I think it's supposed to be D&I team. However, how do you get senior buy-in from, which is integral to getting things off the ground?
I have a kind of little framework which was partly came from working with 2 or 3 groups particularly, and it's this that I find useful. The first thing is to, when you set up the group, or at least when you negotiate with them, this is what the company wants. This is they've had lots of different names, haven't they? Staff networks or employee resource groups or whatever. I can't bear the sort of jargon, but employee resource group sounds to me like the right idea, because what this is a resource for the company. This is not something just for the individuals, but it's a resource for the company. So the first question is, can you help us can you help to add to the voices that are making the strategy of the company real? So what are we getting out of listening to you that we're not getting from listening to the rest of the company? So that's one thing. So the questions that employee resource group should be asked is, how can you contribute to enhancing the strategy and the development of the strategy and the implementation of the strategy of the company? So that puts them into the middle of it rather than the side of it. And it's an interesting question. Second question is that these kind of groups do help individuals navigate. And there's no doubt about it that there is a value in, if there's a game network or whatever, there is a value in negotiating the culture. But it should always be, it seems to me, developed in the way that Holly was talking about, that leadership development should always be focused on people's careers and development. This is not a kind of personal indulgence, these staff networks. They're a function of the company. And the third thing I always say to them is, run events, host an event. So I remember saying this at Rolls-Royce once when I did a thing for the lesbian and gay group at Rolls-Royce. And I said, look, the next event you do, don't do it about lesbian and gay. There's some really bright lesbians and gays in this group who know tons about stuff that you lot really care about fuel usage. And I don't know anything about aeroplanes and aeronautics, but whatever they just said, whatever stuff you do a thing on the key, what's going to make Rolls-Royce competitive in the aerospace industry, whatever they call it. Do the stuff about that. You host a meeting. Okay, great. Put up women and gay men or whatever, lesbians and gay men, to be the experts, but don't mention lesbians and gay. Put yourself into the middle of what the company's about. So those are my 3 things. What's the contribution you're making to the strategy? How are you helping each other develop your careers and develop the knowledge bank and the ability of the company? And thirdly, how can you host events about things that are important to the industry, but that you host?
Excellent. And the next question I'm going to go to here, what can we do as individuals to make sure that companies are not treating diversity and inclusion as a fad or phase? Holiday, do you have any thoughts on that?
What can we do as individuals? I think that is probably where the kind of education, and I don't mean self-education piece, comes in, which is, as an individual, what do you, how much do you know about your company's diversity, inclusion, equity strategy? What do you know about your industry? How are you, what are you holding your company accountable to? Because it's very easy to perform well against poor criteria. So if you really are invested in not being a fad or a phase, you individually need to interrogate whether the criteria your company is using is good. You need to interrogate whether it's still relevant. Look at the risks and the points of failures that are being created by your company's diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. I think probably that's what I would do as an individual, is not to just hold the company to account to what has been said, this is what we're doing and this is good, but to actually interrogate whether that is the right thing, whether the measures of success are the right thing. And I suppose at the kind of intrapersonal level, it's to hold yourself to account to the same things. What are you doing that is performative, that is not actually helpful? and to go on that journey. And that's why I think self-education is helpful, to go on that really honest journey with yourself about where you are operating in a fad and a phased way, because we all are doing that, and to move yourself beyond that.
Yeah. Sarah, this next question touches upon some of the areas that we were talking around sort of not looking at the CV and looking at the testing. So this question here is, where would this sit in the recruitment process? How do you find your long list if you're not using a CV as evidence of ability and experience in the first place? Do you test every applicant?
Okay, so just thinking about the example that I shared for emerging talent. So there's a lot of upfront employer branding going on around, you know, what the organisation is about, what their values are, a cross-sectional group of people talking about what it's like to work there, to help individuals select whether it is the right environment for them to thrive. And I think not asking for the CV, as a result, that testing is actually used for every applicant on that scheme as the first stage. So there's no other application, it's that first stage to get them through to the next stage, and then that next stage is a video interview, and then the final stage is an assessment centre.
Yeah.
So can you just repeat the question? Have I answered that fully?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just think, you know, do we test every applicant? So if we're not looking at those CVs, do we start off testing the applicant?
Yeah, and I'm not advocating that everyone goes through testing. It's very expensive. You know, it's really important with testing that you look at any adverse impact, you look at your sample group. I'm not advocating everyone does testing. There is lots of ways that you can look at taking out bias of a hiring process. As I mentioned, hiring manager capability, thinking about what is it that's in your job description, as we go back to that criteria that's in there. Is it objective? Is it easy to measure? And therefore using that as your basis throughout for your sifting can help significantly reduce bias and diversity coming through.
The problem with using CVs as a quality test or as a threshold is that actually, you know, we make very subjective judgments about whether we think people, based on their CV, pass the test or not. So what we do is we set 3 thresholds in order to go from applicants to long list to short list. And the first, and because what you're trying to say is, when you use the CV as a way of assessing the quality, actually, what are you really trying to assess? What quality do you really want for this particular job? So we asked 3 questions. One, Sarah mentioned this earlier, is there a yes-no qualification? A yes-no question. Is there a qualification you have to have? If you're going to be a head of nursing at wherever, we've just been involved in a head of nursing, you have to be a nurse at a certain level. So there is a yes-no question. But, you know, graduate, really, to be X, Y, and Z? No, actually, seriously. You know, there are lots of jobs where people put in graduate and it's not, and it's often a grading question. So try and find wiggle room. Yeah. First threshold is a yes-no question. Try and get rid of that as much as possible. Second is, exactly what skill do you want for people to display in order to not to be marked, get over the threshold? Ask that question as a situational question. If you were in this situation, what would you bring from your personal and professional background to do the following? That will test what they can actually do. And Iris, again, and others have done a lot of work on past performance doesn't tell you much about future performance. What will tell you about their ability to the job is asking them whether they've got the skills to do the job. And then the third thing is, we ask at all interviews now and all process that we run in Recruiting for Difference, what contribution can you make to help us create greater diversity in order to advance the company or the team? Now, we make that contribution to diversity and talent a threshold. And if they can't answer that question, well, we do. So those are the 3 things. And instead of CVs, what you're doing again is teasing out into in an explicit way, exactly what you're looking for, which stops people going, oh, I just thought this one was better. Well, yeah, but why?
Yeah.
And what preconceptions are you reflecting in that? So I hope that's a helpful sort of little framework.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've kind of pretty much gone through our time now. There is still some more questions, but unfortunately I don't think we're going to have time to get through all of them. I'm just going to put it out to our experts. Do you have, I guess, any closing statements that you'd like to share with everyone that's joined us today, or thoughts on where we can see this D&I conversation and movement sort of evolving over the next 10 years, say? Big question.
I think probably the closing statements that feel very, very important to me to offer, both from a professional perspective and a personal perspective, is, and let me speak from the perspective of race here. We have this incredible moment of time at the moment where the whole world's eyes are on race, and my heart would break if we took this opportunity in a non-thoughtful, quick, performative and faddy way. So people who are listening, who are leaders, who have positions of power, I suppose my wish would be to be thoughtful about what you're doing, to be informed by data, to take time, not to do things because it looks and feels good, but to interrogate at every level, at every stage, why am I doing this? Why is this important? What are the risks? What is the impact on the people who I'm actually purporting to serve? And even if that takes you as an organization 2-3 times as long, but you know you're doing it properly, that for me would be my wish for people in positions of power right now, because we probably won't get this opportunity again in our lifetime, and I think we need to honor it and take it seriously.
Yeah, really valid points.
Holly wrote a brilliant blog, and one of the things that she said in the blog was basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, Holly, so I'm apologising about this, but what it felt like it was saying to me was, oh, so you white people have suddenly discovered racism, has you? Thanks very much. Actually, that's not the point. This has been going on for the rest of us for a long time. So I think one thing, as I would say, is while this is a moment, actually, it doesn't help to say, oh my gosh, it's a moment, if you're white. And I think in terms of the lesbian and gay thing, we've been hacking away at this for, I've been at it for, years and years and years. There aren't actually moments. There are long-term opportunities to create a world, and therefore companies that we want to live and work in. So I think the first thing to do is to say, yes, the drama's there. It's important that we don't waste this opportunity, but it's equally important we don't treat it as a moment. We treat it as part of a process. So I think there are 4 or 5 things that are worth it. One is articulate your desire for diversity in your company in absolutely explicit terms and in relation to what the company is trying to do. Secondly, this is not about adding minorities. This is not about spicing up the stew. This is about changing the recipe. This is about finding ways in which people have access to opportunities and then to each other to contribute in combination to make things better. That means, secondly, that I think that we have to recognise, and this is part of the moment, this fad for unconscious bias training, as if, what this is all about is kind of hidden biases that we don't know about. That I just think that's an excuse. I think that shelves people's responsibility, as I do think Robin DiAngelo's white fragility, all that stuff. It just takes us down the area of, the way to tackle structural inequalities in the world is through personal self-improvement for people who go to book clubs. So can we stop doing this now and actually focus on the structural issues? I think we have to start recognising that what we do in collaboration and in teams. So recruitment and progression, all that stuff has to follow a team model. It's all about what you do in combination with other people. And the last point I'd make, which is this point again about inclusion. If you're serious about diversity and inclusion, then as Holly was saying, you can't then set up a set of language, a set of words that people can or can't use, or a set of behaviours they can or can't do, and then tell them if they don't do it, they're excluded. That's not inclusion. That's not diversity. You have to value difference, see it, value it, and use it. And inclusion means listening and not making assumptions that all minorities have the same view. We should start to argue about values and not identities. That would be my thing. Let's argue about what we do and how we behave rather than who we are.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. A big thank you to our experts. This has been an amazing conversation. Some really interesting insights have come out of this. I think that sort of wraps everything up for today. And yeah, gives us all a lot to think about from here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.